Hi, I'm John Levine. I'm really honored to be getting the Mary Litynski Award this year. So I'm going to tell you a long discursive story about how I got here, which also explains why this award is important. 30 years ago, I was in grad school. I got a Ph.D. in computer science. I went off and did a bunch of very technical stuff, including working on a time series modeling program called Javelin, which was really famous for, 15 or 20 minutes. But while I was working on Javelin, I wrote a book about it along with some other family members. And the book sold pretty well compared to the number of copies of the program we sold. So that made me a credible book author, which allowed me to get an agent. And once I had the agent, then I could go off and I could work on other books. So in 1992, the agent called me up and said, we need somebody to write a book called Unix for Dummies. We hired somebody else to do it and you didn't deliver it. So we're in a real hurry. Could you write it in 6 weeks? And that was a bit of a challenge, but I rounded up my sister, who's very organized, and we wrote like crazy, and it came out pretty well. And it sold pretty well, too. It sold, probably several 100,000 copies, which for a computer book seemed really great. Then in 1993, he called me back and he said, do you know about this internet thing? And I said, yeah, I guess so. And he said, could you write a dummies book about this internet thing? And I said, yeah, I could do that. So we wrote Internet for Dummies, and it sold fantastically, fabulously well, way better than anybody could possibly have anticipated. Because remember, this was 1993, and the internet was pretty exotic, and we didn't realize how much of a success the net would become. So in that first book, I put an email address, both so people could write to me and see that they'd gotten their email going, which was kind of a challenge back in 1993, and also so I could find out if anybody actually read the book. And in fact, I got quite a lot of mail from my readers. Over the past 20 years, I've probably gotten, 100,000 messages from people who've read the book, which is pretty good. But then, starting in the mid-90s, I also started to get a lot of spam. A whole lot of spam. Really, what seemed at the time an unbelievable amount of spam. So I needed to do something about it. So I started to figure out how to do spam filters, which kind of worked. And then we started to figure out who was working on the spam, who was sending the spam, and so maybe we could try and stop them. It turned out that since spam was new, there were no laws about it. So I figured, well, gee, we need to fix that. So that's how I fell in with COSS, the Coalition Against Unsolicited Commercial Email. The idea for COSS was pretty simple. Earlier in the 90s, junk faxes had been a big problem. And there was a very straightforward law against junk faxes that basically said you can't send people junk faxes. And if you do, the recipient can sue you for a modest amount of money. And that law had been quite effective. Junk email had pretty much the same issues as junk faxes, whereas if junk faxes, the cost was the paper and the toner and stuff. In email, it was the storage and the time it took you to deal with it and so forth. So we figured all we needed to do was to adjust the junk fax law to cover email. It seemed very straightforward. In fact, one of the major spammers at the time, Sanford Wallace, had been one of the major junk faxers, and the law had forced him to switch media. So COSS did a surprisingly good job for a tiny little organization with basically no budget. We rounded up some allies. We even managed to arrange for somebody to pay for a lobbyist for a while. And we thought we were going great guns for about 5 years. And then in 2003, when the state of California passed a very effective anti-spam law, the advertising industry got, I think, a little overly concerned about it and passed the canned spam law, which, frankly, is a terrible law. It's the worst, weakest, most lame anti-spam law in the entire world, which was a big setback for us, we thought. But since then, we've actually discovered a couple of things that weren't obvious at the time but are obvious now. One is that most of the spam that people send is in fact illegal under canned spam. There is a trickle of spam from otherwise legitimate organizations, which is really annoying because it's hard to filter. But in terms of the volume, the vast majority of spam is in fact the totally criminal stuff. It's the 419s, and it's the money mule recruiting, and it's the stuff that tries to install malware on your computers, and it's all this blended threat that we all know about now. So what happened at COSS was that we evolved, and in fact the whole approach to dealing with spam evolved. And what I did certainly evolved, which is one of the reasons I'm involved with MAAWG. Another thing I discovered about a legal approach to spam or anything like that is that lawsuits are really expensive and slow. The junk fax lawsuits were intended to be really simple. I mean, you go into your local town court, which we have here in New York where I live, and you file a case which costs about $10, and then the guy has to appear, because in those days, originally, faxes were mostly local because they didn't want to make toll calls. And you held up the fax and you said, "I got this fax. Did you send it?" And he goes, and he says, "Guilty." You lose, and you had to pay him $500. That was the plan. The reality is that junk faxers got really large scale. As phone rates went down, now you had centralized junk faxers who were sending thousands or hundreds of thousands of faxes. You had legitimate businesses who were ignorant or unethical who would hire them. So we had lots of cases where you basically had a class action. You had a big company who had hired a junk faxer to send 10,000 or 100,000 junk faxes. So it turned into a big, complicated case with lots of lawyers and lots of motions and stuff. And big cases are really expensive and they're really hard to handle, which means they're totally unwieldy. And the same thing for spam. Although with canned spam, in principle, anybody who runs a mail system can file a small suit against spammers. In practice, it doesn't happen. The only people who are worth taking to court are the really high volume, high criminal spammers. So I've been an expert witness in a bunch of spam cases. I was an expert witness last year in a case in Philadelphia for the guy who sent all that hoodie spam, who indeed went to jail and isn't spamming anymore. And I was an expert in a case in Trenton, New Jersey, over Thanksgiving, for a guy who was sending pump and dump spam, which again was completely illegal and it was very large scale. But the Justice Department had to invest an enormous amount of money. They had to have lots of full-time staff and lawyers, and they had to pay me to come down. And that's simply not a practical way to deal with spam. What we actually needed is both the legal approach, which is not going away, and I have great hopes for laws like the Canadian law, which is better than the American law. But we discovered that the approach to spam really needed to be a community approach. And we started to get things like shared blacklists, like Paul Bixby's original RBL, and Spam House, which really is run by a bunch of mostly volunteers. And the only reason Spam House is effective is because people actually believe that what they do is worthwhile, and other providers voluntarily use the data that Spam House provides. And beyond that, every ISP, certainly in North America and in Europe, and most of the ISPs in the world have realized that spam in the short run might make some money, but in the long run it's bad for business. So that every ISP now has an anti-spam policy. Most ISPs enforce them. I mean, every ISP that's here certainly enforces them. And every ISP that enforces it has to pay for people to do the enforcement. And the reality is that the people who do the enforcement all need to know each other, and they all need to talk to each other. And they need to cooperate, because if you had to go through complicated formal channels every time you dealt with some tweak to your spam problem, it'd be the same problem as having to bring a spammer into court. It would be too complicated and too slow. So that, in fact, the only way we've learned to deal with spam, and the way we've learned to deal with malware, which we now know is totally integrated with spam as a sort of a global integrated threat, is that it's a community, and that the people dealing with spam in the various ISPs know each other. They know the people dealing with spam in legal places. I mean, I exchange mail with people at the FBI and the IRS and various other government agents. That's the Federal Trade Commission a lot. We work with them all the time. So what I've discovered is that I kind of backed into being a community activist in computer security. And it's not the technology of computer security. I mean, I understand how crypto works, but I don't claim to be a big crypto expert. But what I discovered is that what we need is that people need to talk to each other, and that in many cases it takes a little while to explain to a new provider, or a provider in a country that hasn't had a lot of previous online contact with the larger internet community, that you have problems with your customers. You need to take these complaints seriously when they come from other providers. You need to understand which providers are important, which people you talk to are credible. I mean, I know there's certain people that if they send me a message saying, I think there's some spam coming out of your system. For some people who I would say, oh, it's another fake header. But there's other people for whom I would say, if they say so, I believe them. So it's a community, and so I guess I'm an activist in that community because I talk to a lot of people. I mean, in my role at COST, I go to a lot of meetings. I talk to a lot of people on the phone. I do a certain amount of training, but a lot of it is simply telling this person here that you might want to talk to that person there, and that just getting people to talk together and discovering that we really have a lot of shared goals and shared interests is something we all want to do. So although I did not have any visibility into the committee that apparently awarded me this award, but I'm presuming that's why they did it. That's why I appreciate it, and I think that's what points out that it's important that although individual activities are important, that the only way we're going to make any progress in making the internet actually work for people, and making it actually safe, and making it actually productive, and making it a place and a system that people will want to use, is that we got to keep working together on it. And with that, I'm just going to give you one other little note, which is that I went to college with a bunch of fairly high-powered people, and one of my college roommates actually won a Nobel Prize. He was a really famous, important guy, and I always felt like a total loser because, he won a really important prize, and I didn't. But now, I've also won a really important prize, and I appreciate it. So, thanks a lot. See you in Vienna.